So you need to understand literally the language that she uses, but you also need to understand the literary devices that Austen uses. Okay, great question, Albert. The page for the glossary, I think that's what you're asking me, is page 45. So you have a glossary of terms, page 45 to, let me check, 47. Okay, so it's well worth having a look there, okay? That is there, okay? Now, what I'm showing you right now on the screen is not in this booklet, okay? It's not in this booklet. It's the next booklet that we do in later on that has the literary devices in it. But I think it's really important that you know them now, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of these literary devices and I'm going to ask you to think about doing a task, okay? And that I'll add it to the list, but that task is give me examples of all of these of when they're really important in the text, okay? So as mentioned before, Austen characterises her characters through a range of literary techniques. So it's interesting, characterisation is achieved through the use of literary techniques or devices, but it's also a device in itself. Go figure. Okay, what she does do is she often uses dialogue to give us a sense of how people are relating to one another, whether they have a relationship that is, equal, whether they have a relationship that is, far more sort of lopsided in terms of power, etc. Okay, so think about the kinds of things that author tells us that allow us to understand a character. So what information do we get when we're reading a text, not watching a movie, but reading a text that tells us about a character? What do you think? Like, how do you get a picture of what Darcy looks like or sounds like in your mind? Well, what we see is we see a physical description, don't we? So we might get physical description. We might get dialogue that shows tone. Okay, it's in the interactions that we see this, isn't it? It's in their behaviours. So there's a whole range of things that we're given. Yeah, their attitudes towards others. Albert, you're right. The way they treat other people, the way that they think, okay? Now, interestingly, making connections across different texts now, in Much Ado About Nothing, how do we know how people think? We know because they have their soliloquies, okay? So which is, when in a play, a character is talking to the audience or talking to themselves aloud so the audience can understand their thoughts. Here, we often get letters, okay? So that's really interesting. So what you'll see is these literary devices they're like little onion skins. You kind of peel them back and they link to one another, okay? So the setting becomes really important here, and there's a lot of information on the setting in here, okay? So when you see Lizzie, for example, where do we often see Lizzie? We see her outside. We see her in the great outdoors. We see her walking all the way to Meryton, okay? We see her with her muddy shoes. What do they suggest? If I'm looking at that at a symbolic level, what does the outside sort of walking, what do those things evoke? Well, they might evoke this notion of freedom. Okay, if you're walking somewhere, it might be the notion of journey. Yeah, you're right. It's about freedom from social norms. It's about breaking free from the confines, the rigid confines, etc., etc. And it's also, to me, about that notion of the journey. She's always making a journey. But we do see many physical journeys throughout, okay, which is really, really interesting. So have a look at notes on the setting and the different settings, okay? Have a look at the satire that's used. Okay, there's lots of really funny parts in the novel that you really need to think about. Why would Austen be satiric? What is she trying to point out? What is she trying to highlight? We also see two very important forms of irony, okay? So verbal irony is when one person says something that means the opposite. And we see that when people are being polite, particularly Darcy. He often says something, but the message in it is the exact opposite of what he's actually saying. So in some ways, he might be appearing to flatter you, but he's actually insulting you. Okay, so verbal irony is really interesting, and dramatic irony. We are sometimes aware of characters' real situations, of what's going on before the character is. What's that also called? When we know something that the other characters don't know, or characters don't know. What's another word for that? Let's have a think about that. Can be a form of foreshadowing. Okay, so it can be a form of foreshadowing. Then we have the caricature. Okay, this is this exaggerated sort of characteristics of particular characters, and it's done for to ridicule, to highlight some of the sort of, I guess, ridiculous, some of the sort of really sort of exaggerated, silly things. And we certainly see this with Mrs. B, Mr. C, and we do see this with the stuck-up Miss Lady, Lady D. Burke. Okay, absolutely. Think also about the notion of letters and how these letters actually allow the plot to move forward. These letters actually give us more information. So one of the letters that's really important is the letter that Darcy writes to Lizzie after she's rejected his marriage proposal. Do you remember that one? Why did Darcy write to Lizzie? What did he want to tell her? What did he want to tell her? Does anyone remember? What did he want to tell her? Yeah, okay, you're right. To justify his pride, I agree with that. And he wanted to justify his pride. In some ways, he also wanted to rebut her suggestion that he had treated Wickham poorly, or that he had done the wrong thing, okay? So he does admit that he interfered with the relationship between Jane and Bingley, but he also wants to set her right. In this way, we're really sort of clearly seeing that he's still concerned about what she thinks about him. He's still concerned about how he's being perceived, which is really interesting. So too, I want you to consider the range of symbols and motifs. One of the big things, I mentioned 3 kinds of evidence: quotes, literary devices, and authorial intent. One of the big things I like to see is symbols and motifs. Okay, they're the things that really speak to you, because symbolism is by its very nature, it's analytic. It's taking something and actually looking deeper at it. So understanding the symbols and motifs is a really important part of what we're doing. Let's have a look at some of those symbols and motifs. I did say I was going to add something to this, didn't I? Hang on, what was I doing? Yes, I remember now. I'll just add this quickly before I forget. I hate saying I'm going to do something and then not doing it. 5. Find examples of literary devices from text. Okay, so find them, have a look at them, okay? So let's have a look at the symbols and motifs, and we're going to page 41. Let's go to page 41, people. "41, where are you, 41? Okay. So I'm hoping you understand the difference between a symbol and a motif. Okay, so I don't really care if you get the 2 terms confused, that's okay. A motif is just more patterned, it's more repetitive than a symbol, okay? Don't get too worried about it, but I do want you to understand that there are some really important symbols and motifs, okay? So don't get too hung up about conflating them, but they are technically different, okay? The first one is houses, and we see some really different houses, okay? I mentioned before that Rosings Park is, it's very austere. It's very sort of, it's fancy, okay? It's really, you know, it's all about a show of wealth, the carriage with all of the horses. Pemberley is arguably an even finer house, but it's not described that way. Austen doesn't focus on all of the fittings. She presents Pemberley as far less sort of, you know, I guess, grand in a way, and that's reflecting how Austen sees these characters. She sees Darcy as different, fundamentally different to de Burgh, okay? That's what's really interesting, okay? So you see houses, and they represent different estates, different families, okay? And we also see this notion of the outdoors, okay? So the outdoors are symbolic of freedom, as we mentioned before. The motifs, oh, Catherine, get upset when that happens. The motifs, okay, the things that we see over and over again is this notion of courtships and of courting, this sort of, you know, the sort of mores, the rules around how people become married and why marriage is so important. Marriage is important for status, and it's also important for, you know, economic security. Okay, so we see a whole range of different courtships. I mentioned before that we see the convenience relationships, we see the love, we see the unhappy. We see the coerced, forced, okay? Wickham and Lydia in the end. Lydia, I guess, that they, you know, Wickham forces Lydia, and she in turn, you know, forces the situation, which is sad. Letters are a motif. They are a form of communication, and letters become this sort of, you know, I guess, symbol of news and of gossip, and they also do this sort of, you know, this sort of insight into the writer's thoughts and feelings, and as we said before, they propel the plot forward. Okay, then we have notions of journeys. Okay, and if you think about the entire plot of the novel, it's set over a year, so it's the seasons, and what we see is this cycle. Okay, a cycle of one courtship season to another, which is really, really interesting, okay? And that suggests a period of change, but we know that not everyone changes. So please do have a look at those, okay? Worth a look.